July 1st, 2018, Réau Prison, 50 kilometers south of Paris. One helicopter. 7 minutes. Gone. And the craziest part? This wasn't his first escape. He'd already broken out of a maximum security prison 5 years earlier, using explosives hidden in tissue packets. Redoine Faïd was serving 25 years for armed robbery and the death of a 26-year-old police officer. On this July morning, a helicopter descended into the prison courtyard. Armed commandos jumped out with assault rifles and angle grinders, and Faïd walked out through the smoke. But this isn't just a story about a helicopter landing in a prison yard. It's about the man who learned how to commit crimes by watching Hollywood movies. The pilot who was taken hostage at gunpoint and forced to fly into a maximum security prison, and the one design flaw that made the entire escape possible. His brother was sitting across from him when the helicopter landed. The brother who had no idea what was about to happen. The brother who would later tell police he had nothing to do with it. This is how a man obsessed with gangster films escaped from prison twice, became France's most wanted criminal, and proved that sometimes reality is more cinematic than fiction. Who was Redoine Faïd? And how did a boy from the housing projects of northern Paris become the most daring escape artist in French history? The answer started with a childhood shaped by poverty, abandonment, and an obsession that would define everything he ever did. Redoine Faïd was born on May 10, 1972, in Creil, a gritty suburb about 50 kilometers north of Paris. He was one of 12 children born to Algerian immigrant parents who had arrived in France in 1969. His father worked in a chemical factory in Villers-Saint-Paul. The pay was modest, the hours were long. The family struggled to make ends meet, 12 children sharing cramped public housing. Money was always tight, opportunity was scarce. In 1988, when Redoine was 16 years old, his father abandoned the family. He returned to Algeria to start a new life. He left behind 12 children and a mother who couldn't support them all. What does it do to a teenage boy when his father walks out? What happens when the man who was supposed to protect you simply disappears? For Redoine Faïd, it created a void, a burning anger, a determination to prove himself in any way possible. 3 years later, in 1991, his mother died of leukemia. He was 19 years old, already a petty criminal, already drifting toward the life that would define him. Now he was essentially an orphan. But something else defined young Redoine Faïd, something that would shape every crime he would ever commit. He was obsessed with American gangster films. Scarface, Reservoir Dogs, Heat, Pulp Fiction, Goodfellas. He didn't just watch these movies, he studied them, he memorized them, he treated them like instruction manuals. While other teenagers were playing sports, Faïd was analyzing heist sequences frame by frame. He was taking notes on getaway routes. He was memorizing dialogue about criminal honor codes. Can a movie really teach someone how to commit crimes? Can fiction become a blueprint for reality? For Redoine Faïd, the answer was yes. Years later, Faïd met Michael Mann, the director of Heat, at a Paris film festival. He walked up to Mann and said, "You were my technical advisor." He wasn't joking. In his 2010 autobiography, Faïd wrote that movies were like a user's guide for armed robbery. He claimed to have watched Heat over 100 times. He analyzed every scene, every tactic, every getaway, and then he applied what he'd learned to real life. By his early 20s, Faïd had formed his own criminal gang. They specialized in robbing armored trucks and banks. His crew included his brothers and cousins, blood relatives who would never betray him. How do you rob an armored truck like a professional? Faid had the answer. He'd seen it in a movie. In 1997, Faïd and his crew carried out an armed robbery while wearing ice hockey goalkeeper masks. Just like Robert De Niro's crew in Heat, the heist was successful, the money disappeared, and Faïd's reputation began to grow. But success brought attention, and attention brought consequences. That same year, 7 members of his gang were arrested and tried for armed robbery, jewel theft, and extortion. Faid wasn't among them. He'd fled France. For the next 3 years, Faid lived on the run. He traveled to Switzerland, then to Israel. He disguised himself as an ultra-Orthodox Jew. He learned Hebrew. He trained in firearms with an Israeli soldier. In 1998, French authorities finally caught up with him. He was arrested and sentenced to 30 years in prison. But Faid was released on parole after serving just 10 years. In 2009, he walked out of prison a free man. He swore he'd changed. He wrote a book about his criminal past. He went on an extensive media tour. He appeared on French television, charming, articulate, repentant. It was a lie. Within months of his release, Faid was back in the criminal world. The book tour, the television appearances, the promises of redemption, all of it was a performance. He'd never stopped being a gangster. Remember that media tour? Remember those promises of redemption? They were about to matter. May 20th, 2010, Villiers-sur-Marne, east of Paris. A gang attempted to rob an armored truck carrying cash. The plan was supposed to be clean, quick, professional, like a scene from Heat. But something went wrong. A police patrol spotted the robbery in progress. Officers moved in. The robbers panicked. A high-speed chase erupted through the streets of eastern Paris. Cars weaving through traffic, tires screeching, sirens wailing. Then the gunfire started. Bullets flew between the robbers and pursuing police. Civilians ducked for cover, windows shattered. When the smoke cleared, 26-year-old police officer Aurélie Fouquet was dead, shot during the pursuit. A young woman with her whole life ahead of her, gone in an instant. The robbers escaped, but investigators began piecing together the evidence. Who planned this heist? Who was the mastermind behind the robbery that killed a young police officer? Investigators traced the crime back to Redoine Faïd. He was identified as the organizer, the man who had planned every detail, the man who had applied the lessons from his beloved movies to a real-world robbery. In 2011, he was arrested for violating his parole conditions. He was ordered to serve the remainder of his previous sentence. Then he was charged with his role in the Fouquet murder. By 2013, Faïd was locked up in Séquedin prison in northern France, near Lille, facing decades behind bars. But Redoine Faïd had no intention of serving those decades. How do you escape from a modern French prison? How do you break through steel doors designed to contain the country's most dangerous criminals? Faïd had a plan that sounded like something straight out of a movie. Séquedin prison was built in 2005. It was considered a modern, secure facility. It housed over 800 inmates. It had 220 guards. State-of-the-art surveillance systems monitored every corridor. But Faïd saw something the designers hadn't considered: the visiting room, the one place where inmates had contact with the outside world, the one place where things could be smuggled in. What if someone hid explosives in tissue packets? What if those explosives were powerful enough to blow through steel doors? Would anyone think to check tissue packets for dynamite? Nobody did. April 13th, 2013, Saturday morning. Faïd's wife came to visit him. According to investigators, she brought him something hidden in tissue packets: explosives. After the visit ended, Faïd made his move. He pulled out a pistol. He took 4 prison guards hostage, and then he started blasting his way out. He detonated explosives to destroy 5 prison doors, one after another. Steel doors designed to contain France's most dangerous criminals, blown apart by a man with tissue packets full of dynamite. Faïd used the guards as human shields. He released them one by one as he got further from the prison. The first guard was released just outside the prison walls, the second a few hundred meters away. The final 2 were left along a nearby highway. All 4 were unharmed, but they were in shock, traumatized by the experience of being held at gunpoint while bombs exploded around them. Prison guards unions described the escape as an act of war. They complained that Séquedin was inadequate for holding such dangerous convicts. They demanded better security measures. How could a man smuggle explosives through the visiting room? How could the security screening have failed so completely? The answer was simple. Nobody expected tissue packets to contain dynamite. What happened next showed just how well Faïd had planned. Outside the prison, a getaway car was waiting. The driver was Sabri Trad, a former Special Forces officer, someone with military training, someone who knew how to evade pursuit. Faïd jumped in. They drove to Lille. They set the car on fire to destroy evidence. They switched to a second vehicle. And then Redoine Faïd vanished into the French countryside. The manhunt was enormous. Interpol issued a continent-wide warrant. Belgian borders were monitored. Every airport and train station was on alert. But Faïd was smart. He grew a beard. He wore a wig. He moved constantly. 6 weeks later, on May 29, 2013, police finally found him. He was hiding in a hotel in Ponteau-Combeau, about 20 kilometers east of Paris. He was arrested without incident. In his possession, police found weapons. They suspected he'd been planning another heist. The 2013 escape had lasted 6 weeks. It had humiliated the French prison system, and it had cemented Faïd's reputation as France's most daring criminal. In 2017, Faïd was sentenced to 10 years for the prison escape. He was also convicted of his role in the 2010 robbery that killed Officer Fouquet. His sentence was 18 years. When his appeal failed in April 2018, it was increased to 25 years. His release date was calculated as 2046. He would be 74 years old. Faïd had a different plan. Could he really escape again? Could lightning strike twice? The French prison system had been humiliated once. Surely they wouldn't let it happen again. But Redoine Faïd was already planning. Redoine prison was supposed to be escape-proof. Located 50 kilometers southeast of Paris, a maximum security facility built to house France's most dangerous criminals, terrorists, drug lords, organized crime bosses, the worst of the worst. The security was formidable. Surveillance cameras covered every angle. Guards patrolled around the clock. Multiple layers of walls separated the inmates from the outside world. Electronic locks, reinforced doors, motion sensors. After Faïd's first escape from Sequedin, French authorities had tightened security across the entire prison system. They weren't going to let it happen again. And Rio had one additional layer of defense. Anti-helicopter netting stretched over most of the compound. Steel mesh designed to prevent exactly the kind of aerial extraction that Faïd was planning. Most of the compound was covered, but not all. There was one area of the prison that wasn't covered by the netting, the courtyard in front of the visiting rooms. Prison officials considered the netting unnecessary there. Inmates only used that area to enter and exit the building. Why would anyone try to land a helicopter in such a small space? They were about to find out. Faïd noticed the gap. According to his later testimony, he called it an irrational flaw, a hole in the security that made no logical sense, a vulnerability hiding in plain sight. But how do you exploit such a flaw from inside a maximum security prison? How do you coordinate a helicopter extraction when your every move is being watched? In the months before July 2018, drones were spotted flying over Rio prison. Investigators would later wonder if they were connected to Faïd. Reconnaissance missions, mapping the facility from above, identifying the gap in the netting, measuring distances between buildings, timing guard patrols down to the second, calculating the exact angle a helicopter would need to approach. Faïd's accomplices on the outside were gathering intelligence. They were studying the prison like military planners, studying an enemy fortress. Every detail mattered. Every second counted. Faïd had learned from his first escape. Explosives had worked at Sequedin. But Rio was different, more secure, better designed, more guards, more cameras, more barriers. He needed something more dramatic, something that would overwhelm the prison's defenses before anyone could react. He needed a helicopter. July 1st, 2018. Approximately 11:15 a.m. At a flight school near Paris, two men posing as students approached a helicopter instructor. They'd scheduled a flying lesson. Everything seemed normal. The instructor prepared the helicopter, an Aerospatiale Alouette 2, a small, maneuverable aircraft, perfect for what they had planned. The two men climbed aboard. The instructor began his pre-flight briefing. Then, everything changed. They pulled out weapons, assault rifles. They pressed the guns against the pilot's head. His life depended on following their instructions exactly. "Fly to Rayo prison," they ordered. What do you do when armed men point guns at your head? What choice did the pilot have? The pilot took off. He flew south toward the prison, his hands trembling on the controls. A gun barrel pressed against the back of his skull. At approximately 11:30 a.m., the helicopter descended toward Rayo prison. It approached from an angle that avoided the anti-helicopter netting. It dropped lower, lower. The rotor wash kicked up dust and debris across the courtyard. A guard on patrol noticed the helicopter first. He looked up. Something wasn't right. A helicopter flying this low over a maximum security prison. He reached for his radio. But it was already too late. The helicopter landed in the courtyard in front of the visiting rooms. Exactly where Faid was meeting his brother. Two armed commandos jumped out, dressed all in black, faces hidden by ski masks. They carried assault rifles and an angle grinder. A third commando stayed with the pilot, keeping a gun pressed against his head. Inside the prison, guards watched in disbelief. They saw the helicopter approaching. They saw it descending into the courtyard. They gave the alert immediately. But what could they do? They were equipped with only whistles and radios, no weapons, no anti-aircraft capabilities, no way to stop a helicopter from landing in their prison. They could do nothing but watch. The two commandos ran toward the visiting room. They used the angle grinder to cut through the door. Sparks flew. Metal screamed. Inside the visiting room, Faid's brother looked up in shock. Other visitors panicked. Some hit the floor. Others pressed against the walls. The grinding continued. Seconds felt like hours. Every second that passed was another second for authorities to respond. Another second for armed police to arrive. The door fell away. They threw smoke grenades. Clouds of thick white smoke filled the air. Visibility dropped to near zero. The visiting room disappeared behind a wall of smoke. Through the chaos, Redoine Faïd walked out. He climbed into the helicopter. The rotors were still spinning. The pilot was still at gunpoint. The helicopter lifted off. It rose above the prison walls. It flew north, toward Paris. Total elapsed time from touchdown to liftoff, 7 minutes and 33 seconds. Less than 8 minutes, an eternity for the guards. A blink of an eye for Faid. And then, he was gone. For the first time in 5 years, no walls, no bars, no guards watching his every move, no count at 6 a.m., no lockdown at 9 p.m., no steel doors slamming shut behind him. Just the sound of rotor blades cutting through the summer air. Just the French countryside stretching out below him. Just the warm July wind on his face. Just freedom. He'd done it again. The man who had blown through 5 steel doors with dynamite hidden in tissue packets had now flown out of prison in a helicopter. 2 escapes, 2 maximum security prisons, 2 methods that belonged in a movie. But how long would freedom last? The helicopter flew to Gonesse, a town near Charles de Gaulle Airport. It landed in a field. The commandos released the pilot unharmed, but traumatized. They set the helicopter on fire to destroy forensic evidence. Then they disappeared into a waiting getaway car. The car was later found abandoned and burned in a shopping mall parking lot in Aulnay-sous-Bois. Faid had switched vehicles, again, just like in the movies, just like in Heat. Where would he go now? How long could he evade the largest manhunt in French history? 2,009 police officers were mobilized. Helicopters searched the countryside. Every border crossing was monitored. Interpol issued international alerts. The entire European Union was on watch. French Prime Minister Edouard Philippe called the escape an affront to the entire nation. Justice Minister Nicole Belloubet promised that Faid would be found. The pressure on French law enforcement was immense. This was the second time a single man had humiliated the entire prison system. There could not be a third. But Redoine Faïd had vanished. Again. The manhunt would last 3 months, 92 days of searching, thousands of tips, countless dead ends. During those 3 months, Faïd moved like a ghost. He stayed with family members. He changed locations constantly. He never stayed in one place for more than a few days. Would his family turn him in? Would the pressure of harboring France's most wanted criminal become too much? Faïd was counting on blood loyalty, the same loyalty that had protected him throughout his criminal career. Brothers, nephews, cousins, family who would rather go to prison themselves than betray him. According to prosecutors, he wore a full-face Islamic veil to move around in public. A burqa. It hid his face completely. He blended in. He became invisible. A disguise worthy of a Hollywood movie. On July 24th, 3 weeks after the escape, police spotted Faïd in a parking lot at a suburban Paris shopping mall. He was with his brother, Rashid. Surveillance cameras captured their faces. Police officers moved in. They were about to capture France's most wanted man. But Faïd saw them coming. His instincts, honed by decades of evading capture, kicked in. He and his brother abandoned their car. They walked away calmly. They disappeared into the crowd. They escaped. Again. How many times could one man evade the French police? How much longer could his luck hold out? But their luck was running out. The net was closing. October 3rd, 2018, approximately 4 a.m. 120 French Special Forces officers surrounded an apartment building in Creil, the same gritty suburb where Faïd had been born 46 years earlier, the same housing projects where he'd grown up, the same streets where he dreamed of becoming a gangster. After 3 months on the run, after 92 days of hiding, after evading 2,900 police officers, Redoine Faïd had come home. It was the most predictable hiding place imaginable, and yet it had taken authorities 3 months to find him there. The officers moved in with military precision. They broke down doors. They swept through the building, room by room, floor by floor, apartment by apartment. They found Redoine Faïd, along with his brother and 2 other men believed to be his nephews. They found weapons, evidence of the escape network that had protected him. No shots were fired. No one was injured. The man who had twice escaped from maximum security prisons surrendered without a fight. The most daring escape artist in French history was back in custody, for good this time. What price would Faïd pay for his audacity? What would happen to the family members who had helped him? The trial for the helicopter escape began in September 2023, 5 years after the escape. Faïd stood alongside 11 co-defendants, including his brothers and nephews. The courtroom at Paris's historic Palais de Justice was packed. Security was unprecedented. Mobile phone signals were scrambled. Armed guards surrounded the building. Everyone wanted to see the man who had turned his life into a movie. According to prosecutors, Faïd was a crook who used humor and charm to manipulate people. They warned the jury not to be fooled. They said Faïd had planned every detail of the escape with military precision. They said he had exploited family loyalty to build a criminal network that protected him for 3 months. The pilot who had been taken hostage testified about his trauma. A gun pressed against his head for the entire operation, not knowing if he would survive, not knowing if the helicopter would crash. 7 minutes that had changed his life forever. Faïd showed little remorse. During the 7-week trial, he made jokes. He spoke of a ray of sunshine on his face and the feeling of freedom. He called himself a freedom addict. He said it was an addiction he could not cure. Did the jury feel sympathy? Did they see a desperate man or a dangerous criminal? In October 2023, the court delivered its verdict. Redoine Faïd was sentenced to 14 years for the helicopter escape. His brother Rashid received 10 years for helping saw through the prison doors. His nephews received sentences ranging from 2 to 8 years. Added to his previous sentences, Faïd would spend the rest of his life in prison. Today, Redoine Faïd remains incarcerated in a maximum security facility in France. He is in his 50s. His release date, if he lives that long, is sometime in the 2060s. He will likely never see freedom again. But his story lives on. The man who watched Heat 100 times and turned its lessons into real-world crimes. The man who escaped from prison twice, once with explosives, once with a helicopter. He transformed his life into a gangster film. He became the protagonist of his own Hollywood movie. But every movie has an ending, and for Redoine Faïd, the ending came in a small apartment in Creil, the same housing projects where he'd been born, the same streets where he'd dreamed of becoming a criminal mastermind. He'd gone everywhere, Switzerland, Israel, across France, and in the end, he came home. That's where they found him. The French prison system implemented major changes after Faïd's escapes. Anti-helicopter netting was installed over all outdoor areas at every high-security facility. Security protocols were tightened across the country. High-risk prisoners were transferred more frequently to prevent them from establishing patterns. But the family of Aurélie Fouquet, the 26-year-old police officer killed in the 2010 robbery, found no comfort in Faïd's capture. Their daughter was still dead. No amount of prison time could bring her back. No amount of justice could fill the void she left behind. Faid had exposed the vulnerabilities in the French prison system. He'd proven that even the most secure prisons could be beaten. He'd shown that with enough planning, enough determination, and enough loyalty from family, almost anything was possible. But at what cost? 4 traumatized prison guards from the 2013 escape. A helicopter pilot held at gunpoint for the 2018 escape. A dead police officer whose killer had escaped justice twice. Families torn apart. Lives destroyed. All so one man could live out his Hollywood fantasy. For 7 minutes and 33 seconds, Redoine Faïd had achieved the impossible. He'd flown out of prison, and he'd done it exactly like they do in the movies. But real life isn't a movie. In real life, there are victims. In real life, there are consequences. In real life, even the most daring escape artist eventually runs out of places to hide. Redoine Faïd learned that lesson in a cramped apartment in Creil, the same housing projects where his story began, the same streets where a fatherless boy had dreamed of becoming something more. He'd become something more, France's most notorious criminal, the man who escaped twice. But in the end, the law caught up with him, just like it always does. And that brings us to the end of our story. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe, and activate the bell button so you can receive new videos.